Here is Sailor Studio 967. This is a nice olive green that tends to be a little bit lighter than the tone that we get in a swatch. There is a ton of tone shift as papers change, and it always shades really nicely. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, this performs very well with no feathering and no signs of aggression. I certainly would enjoy a bottle and would see no problem really burning through it very quickly to where I wind up needing a second bottle shortly after.
The pen for today is a Platinum 3776. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
It must entirely be the Marine Corps part of me that sees olive green and just really tends to enjoy it. This doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade very well. Doesn't give me the camouflage shading that I love so much, but I will live with it for such a great tone on the page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Studio 573. Here is Sailor Ink of the Witch. Here is Sailor Kobe number 59, Guion Romance. Here is Sailor Virginia.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here the tone is the same as it is on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. With an ink like this, you get to use a paper like this without losing any of the great qualities that it has. It always looks amazing. Look at multi-sets with multi-tones of green within it. You can choose constantly. Not really you can choose, but you can spot them. The M is a bit darker than the UL. The T gets slightly darker. The IS gets quite dark. The ET lighten just a little bit as it comes down into that T, and the S at the end, much darker. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. I might call it slightly darker. Really, I don't think this is a translucent ink. I think it's getting slightly darker as a result of the makeup of the paper. We have a more opaque ink here that doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does tend to shade. That's a nice generalization to say. When you look at generalization on the third line, you can see the GE is a little bit darker than the NER. The A starts working its way lighter. The Liz right there in the middle does get a whole lot darker. The ATIO, a nice midtone with a darker N at the end. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. And most importantly, it stands out against this quad rule without any kind of a problem. This, if you're a student using this, then bravo, because you have chosen a great tone of green that's performing very well. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more green inks.
Here is Diamine Green Black. Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Viper Green. Here is Krishna Mint. Here is Monteverde Olivine.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a Composition Lab notebook.
Here the tone is just a little bit lighter and flatter, and I don't want to call it flatter here because it's an olive green. Let's call it a little bit more subdued. That way we can kind of head back towards that Marine Corps time in my life. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade, but nowhere near as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. But look at element on the fourth line. We see most drastic shading here compared to anywhere else. Nice mid-tone with the E-L-E. The M gets a little bit darker. The E lightens, the N darker, the T much darker at the end, where the element above it is mostly a lighter tone with a slightly darker T at the end. It does still stand out against the quad rule, and it does warrant a bonus point if you're a student using this in a lab notebook. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Monteverde Topaz. Here is Diamine Violet. Here is Private Reserve Fast Dry Ultra Black. Here is Camlin Scarlet Red. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is a bit lighter than we get on the Clairfontaine. We do have a tiny bit of feathering that occurs right there. I don't see it anywhere else. I could be wrong, maybe right there as well. It does not have spread for being on copy paper, so I'm going to sort of let go of the feathering, which is normally a bigger problem to me than it is going to be right here. I'm going to let it go because while it's got those couple of spots of feathering, it's not spreading. It's not being distracting. It looks good on the page. It does continue to shade. This could be a great ink to use on copy paper. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem with over-aggression. An amazing ink. It's great for copy paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The dry medium of the Platinum 3776 gives a nice olive green with plenty of shading. Now, off camera, I tried this in a wet medium, and it got much darker while still shading. Now, both the lighter and darker versions of what I saw look great and shade well. So for me, since this will always look good, it is, in fact, a dealer's choice. I enjoyed it from the dry medium. I loved it from the wet medium. So for me, personally, I go for a wet medium pen.